So without further ado, I'm going to say a very big welcome to our chair for this evening, Faye McGuinness. Over to you, Faye. Diolch yn fawr.
Shemai a croeso. Hello and welcome to this event. It's an absolute pleasure for us to be delivering this event in partnership with EWC. So I'll start by just telling you a little bit about us, Education Support. Who are we? We are the only UK charity dedicated to supporting the mental health and well-being of everybody working in the education sector. We have been around for about 145 years. We were set up by teachers for teachers. Obviously, I haven't been around for that long, but the organisation certainly has. And during that time, we have been supporting education staff in Wales, and we've been delivering that through via different methods. So we deliver a helpline, a 24-hour helpline for everybody working in education. We deliver financial support to the education sector. We have an employee assistance programme, and particularly over the past couple of years with funding from Welsh Government, we have been working directly with schools to help them think about how you can create the cultures and conditions to really prioritise staff mental health and well-being. And alongside that, we've been developing support and delivering support for leaders, particularly during COVID. As we know, it's been a very difficult couple of years for everybody leading the work in schools. So we are Education Support, and we're really excited about today's event because there's no doubt that well-being and mental health has been high on the agenda over the past couple of years. But this event really is talking about not just the why, but the how. So we talk a lot about why mental health and well-being is important, but what's really important is we also focus on the how. What do you do? How do you get started? What are the strategies that you need to understand? What are the practical hints and tips that you can take away to really think about how you prioritise staff wellbeing in your school? So that's what today's event is really about. It's about getting under the skin of some of those practical tips. And we've got a really excellent panel who are going to share some of their experiences. So what I'm going to do is introduce the panel, and then each of them are going to speak for sort of 4 or 5 minutes, sharing some of their experiences. But what we've done is left enough time for question and answers, because we want a real opportunity here for you to ask the questions that matter to you, and hopefully the panel will be able to answer them for you. So the panel that we have today, we have Lisa Michelle Thomas, who is the Principal and Chief Executive of the College Merthyr Tydfil. We have Nina Jackson, who is one of our Education Support Associates and also a mental health and wellbeing consultant. And we have Kelly Forrest McKay, who's a head teacher at St Illtyd's Primary School. So a nice mix of experience there for them to share their experience. So I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand over to Lisa, who's going to start with our presentations. Thank you, Lisa.
Hi, Faye, and thanks very much for inviting me along this afternoon to this webinar. I'm certainly not going to be talking for 4 or 5 minutes. I'm going to give you quite a brief introduction, really, and just really try and set the context of my institution and, you know, how we set about prioritising the health and well-being of our staff. So, you know, like many institutions, I'm sure represented here this afternoon, we are all committed to the health and well-being of everyone who works and studies at our colleges, at our schools, at our institutions. And after all, our staff are our greatest asset. Without the contribution of a healthy, well-motivated staff, we would not, as leaders of institutions, be able to deliver the outstanding learning experience that we all aspire to provide. So if I reflect back when we were first developing our 5-year strategic plan back in 2018-19, I think at that point we identified that health and well-being of learners, but also staff, had to be one of our key priorities. And that we needed to ensure that our learners and our staff enjoy a safe and supportive and inclusive learning and working environment where everyone feels recognised, everyone feels valued as individuals, where people are encouraged to develop their personal resilience, and where they're given the opportunity to contribute their views and ideas, but also enjoy access to appropriate guidance, activities, support and training to help them manage their work-life balance. Now, I think it's fair to say that, you know, at the beginning of that strategic plan, we felt the college had begun to make good progress in that area. When, of course, in March 2020, we were then hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think it's the pandemic and the ensuing lockdowns meant that we were really, as leaders, confronted with an unprecedented challenge. How do we keep staff and learners safe and well, whilst at the same time keeping that learning going? Recognizing that staff had been forced to move to remote online teaching and working, whilst at the same time they were juggling family commitments, homeschooling. Many of them, we need to recognize, were suffering illness, they were suffering loss and bereavement, as well as also a feeling of isolation. And I think it's fair to say, since, you know, the restrictions around the pandemic have relaxed, the subsequent return to the workplace and the resumption of face-to-face teaching has further highlighted the long-term impact that the COVID pandemic has had, not only on our current workforce, but on our future workforce, and the changing expectations of our staff, of us as employers. So I think, you know, it forced us to really question then is, you know, how can we continue as an institution to support staff mental health and well-being, but at the same time also encourage staff to consider their own personal responsibility for maintaining their own mental health and well-being. So I'm really looking forward this afternoon to be perhaps able to share some of the strategies that we've introduced at Merthyr, but also recognising that there are also other areas that we're committed to developing going forward. So look forward to the discussion this afternoon. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lisa. So I'm going to hand over to Nina now. Nina, over to you.
Good
afternoon to all of you.
It's a real privilege to be with you all today. And I don't know about you, but well-being is about having that excitement and that effervescent feeling when we gather together in a communal space, even though it's currently today online. So I'm here as part of education support and as part of myself, really. I work with education support, and my role with well-being is to pull together amazing leaders where we coach and supervise and help people to be able to find that extra little bit of magic where sometimes it's actually lost. Now, let's be fair. If we're talking about mental health and well-being, we're all going to have grey days, grr days, wet lettuce days, call them what you like days, really. And these happen in our workplaces day in, day out. What's clear to me in my role also as an educational consultant, where I actually work globally, you know, I've been working with a suicide squad in Hong Kong. I've been rescuing street children in Chile to give them a curriculum of something from nothing. But predominantly, the most important thing is that collectively and wholeheartedly, everybody has a voice and a sense of belonging. And with that, if we're talking about practical strategies, let's think about how do we give everybody hope in a workplace. We give them hope because we give them a voice. We give them hope to understand how their purposeful intervention as a professional and as a learner can have a future effect on the world. As amazing human beings, each and every one of you are, you know that you're going to be riding those emotions, riding the waves, as I call them. And maybe a little bit later, what I can do with you is share a few strategies and slides and practical things that you can actually do. And what was amazing is that Lynette actually spoke about that we start with ourselves. And this is where I say about self-awareness and self-care and thinking about the dual carriageway movement that we need to maneuver, you know, thinking about the learning, the professional journey that we're actually going on, and that sometimes has to take one lane, but then at other times then we have to put the well-being and the priorities of self, and we have to overtake that so that we can then come back up to the professional level that we expect to be. For me, it's also about sharing things as well through the written word. And I've written many books, a few by myself, and I'm currently writing my next book called Schools Being Well, an International Curriculum of Care. Now, you may be thinking, how do you embed and interweave well-being on a day-to-day basis? Surely if you had a specific theme every month with lots of resources so that you wouldn't have to think about extra workload. That's what my next book will actually prepare you to think about. But predominantly, I'm going to ask you today to think about this. If you've got a headache, what do you do if you've got a headache? That's in response to a physical need. It might be that you need some more hydration. It might mean that you need an extra bit of sleep. Or it might mean that you know that you've got to maybe reach for a paracetamol, ibuprofen, and not that glass of wine, let me let you know. But if that's the physical side, what are you doing for the well-being side? So when actually a professional or a child in your school is feeling what I call under the weather, not diagnosed with a particular issue at this point, but general well-being, this is where I want you to think about something called mind medicine. Okay, so if you've got a headache, what do you do? That's the physical side. With your well-being, you starting first with addressing your self-care and self-awareness. What do you know that works for you straight away before you have to reach out for external support? And it's a real privilege for me to be here with Kelly and Lynette today, because they're in those educational settings where sometimes, where they're giving you fantastic support, maybe a little bit of their well-being dips down as well because you're being overloaded. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a flavour of where I'm coming from, and I've got lots more to share.
Great, that was a great introduction. Thank you, Nina. So before I hand over to Kelly, just a reminder, any questions that you have, anything related to staff mental health and wellbeing, please do put it in the chat. I've got some questions already that I want to ask the panel, and also feel free to put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question verbally. We invite all questions in all ways. So Kelly, over to you.
Hello, and I'm very grateful that I actually made it today because unfortunately our systems went down in the local authority. So in true head teacher style, where we used to be in proactive and reactive, I managed to get myself home and here just in time. So it's lovely to be here with you all. In honesty, I'm going to give you a real transparent, reflective sort of narrative around my journey as a head teacher. I actually became acting head teacher of my school at St Tilted's Primary in Blaenau Gwent. 2 weeks later, we had community floodings where 4 streets were actually wiped out due to the embankment breaking and flooding the houses. And then very closely related to that was COVID. So as you can imagine, I've had a bit of a baptism of fire as a new head teacher. But thankfully, because of my building blocks leading up to that point, I was able to use my experience of being a pastoral lead and a wellbeing lead for 13 years prior to that. I've worked for Welsh Government and I've been involved with writing the new curriculum, especially focused on health and wellbeing. So thankfully, due to all of those lovely networks that I developed and colleagues such as Nina, who I've come across previously when presenting, I was able to draw upon that experience and apply that to my new school setting as a head teacher. So obviously, just to give you a little bit of a picture, unfortunately, we were a school that was quite, significantly impacted by COVID. Out of 19 members of staff, I was averaging 8 members of staff off at a time. Some members of staff who had repeated, issues with COVID, including myself, or unfortunately contracted it 3 times as well. So as you can imagine, it was quite a juggling act to try and keep staff resilience, staff morale, and actually just school resilience, keeping school classrooms open, etc. So that's our sob story to start with, just to explain how challenging it was and how difficult, along with the day-to-day running of the school as well. So, for example, at one point I was left for 2 months without any senior leadership team or deputy to try and, you know, carry on with the strategic thinking when we're so much embroiled with operational matters as well, isn't it? So I'm sure that lots of head teachers, you know, in the room and leaders in the room can, you know, associate with those difficult times, you know, during this pandemic, isn't it? So very quickly recognise that as part of our professional learning plans, I had to incorporate wellbeing for staff. It was like a no-brainer basically. So what I did, I contacted education support and Anthony Priest at the time. We arranged fortnightly sessions for staff for them to have some just to make sure that they were keeping themselves, you know, equipped and their cups were filled in order for them to be able to, you know, to be resilient and deal with the issues that they've been presented with. So just as another practical example, we did that on a fortnightly basis. So they had some sort of presentations around managing their own stress levels, recognising signs and symptoms of stress, making sure that they took space and time without the guilt, because as we know, as teachers, we tend to, you know, we rescuers, we tend to absorb ourselves in all school matters, but then leave ourselves then, you know, sort of neglected because of that. So it's just a way to help refocus staff. Another practical example, I did a weekly drop-in session for staff. So I made myself available and the leadership available just to have a check-in with staff. It didn't have to be about school matters. It could just be about any personal issues that they needed to bring forward, just that space and that time and that opportunity to be able to chat with somebody and have that open, frank conversation with somebody about challenges they might have had. Another practical example that we did was separate your performance management conversation from a care support and guidance conversation. So we made sure that those two conversations were distinct and purposeful, because a lot of my you know, higher performing staff are not very good at looking after their own well-being. So is to make sure that we had that distinction between both of the entities, really. So yeah, so I don't want to say any more, really. That's just to give you some practical snapshots of things that we've done. But you know, to put it in a nutshell, whole school health and well-being for staff, pupils, the community is integral to our school. And when you know, if you've read our mission statement, you know, you'd see that it is fluid throughout everything that we do. And we're hoping to build on that further now post-pandemic with some of the building blocks that have been put in place there. So, you know, it is going to take time. I think that's the biggest thing for everyone to realise, is that this isn't a quick fix. We are going to be having challenges post-pandemic now, but is making sure that we, you know, we work together and have got all those scaffolded systems in place, and remembering that, you know, it is a journey now, isn't it? Not something that is just going to be a quick fix with a stick in plaster. It's something that needs to be ongoing and embedded into practice and life in our schools, isn't it? So yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kelly. And I think you finished on a really important point there, that this isn't a quick win. You know, looking at staff mental health and well-being is a lifelong commitment, because cultures change, cultures evolve, people change. We're dealing with human beings, and human beings are complex. As we know, we are all complex beings. So the commitment to prioritising staff mental health and well-being is you know, it's a commitment for a long-term piece of work. And I think it can sometimes feel quite scary. Where do we start? How do we start this big piece of work? And hopefully today we can share some sort of small tips about how you can get started, and recognizing that actually those small steps can start that longer journey. So I'm just going to kick off with a question, and Nina, I might come to you on this because you noted that you had some to share. But can you give us some examples of some effective workplace wellbeing strategies? What are some of the things that are that are effective for creating that culture where staff wellbeing is seen as a priority?
Thanks, Faye. I think what we'll do is we'll start with what both Lisa and Kelly have actually said, which is this sense of belonging and giving everybody a voice. And when I talk about belonging, we're not talking about the children and the young people. We're not talking just about the staff and the leadership team, but we're talking about governors, community and parents as well. And it may be that what you're thinking about whole school, the policy is a written document. The policy, it can do one basically, but it has to be practiced. So what does it look like? It looks like something that when you walk into a school, there's a sense of people looking out for each other. And what do we mean by looking out for each other? Well, it's thinking about what I call the check-in, check-up and check-out process. That may simply be just by, if you've got staff who are wellbeing buddies, or if you've got children as well who are wellbeing ambassadors, that collectively people are monitoring, they're listening, they're checking. You know, as you do, if somebody doesn't look quite themselves, you say, are you all right? And sometimes, you know, just that thing of making it personal, to start off with asking people, is everything okay? How are things going for you? You know, are there any crunch points that you're going to be meeting soon that maybe we could all help out together? And when I talk about, you know, simple steps to save those smiles, it is crucially about, number one, let's think about whole school. What are those key crunch points that we've got during the year? Check your calendar. Where there's reports, where there are Christmas concerts, where there may be parents' evenings, may you be able to then say cut back on other things. But the whole school aspect of well-being, giving everybody that sense of belonging, not just giving them a voice to be able to say how bad everything is, but giving them a voice to say things like, maybe could we think about trying this? Could we think about possibly in every staff meeting having 5-10 minutes to talk about the pressures, but also in balance of the celebrations of things that have happened really well? And that's crucial, because if you're tipping those well-being scales where everybody, and rightly so, is having a positive venting moment, either through text, written or discussion, but having that balance then by bringing it up, for example, when everybody's saying, do you realize how much work I've got to do? Why am I still spending this 10 minutes extra in this meeting? Okay, let's take a different perspective to this. You may have all of these things to do, but just pause with that. What are all the things that you've actually achieved today? So that's where we talk about the well-being balance. And then maybe a little bit later on, I'll bring in some of those other slides. Otherwise, you know what's going to happen. I'm going to talk till 5 o'clock and we're not going to actually hear any more from Kelly or Lisa. So I will mute myself at this point.
Well, we all love hearing you speak, Nina, so that wouldn't be a terrible thing. But Lisa, over to you.
Yeah, just picking up on some of the points that Nina raised there, I think, you know, it's giving the staff that sense of voice. And I give sort of one practical thing that we've done here at Merthyr. So a number of years ago, we set up, the staff set up a forum. And I know some people some leaders in the room might quake with fear and think, oh God, it's just going to become a whinging shop. No, it's not. It's a platform for staff to raise their concerns. But we've also used it as a platform to really consult with staff. And Nina mentioned the calendar. So in FE, we have a slightly different academic year to schools, but one of the things we've done this year now is we've consulted with staff on the calendar for next year. So when do they want their inset days? When do they want parents' evenings? When do they want us to be holding open days? So that they are staggered throughout the year at appropriate times, taking into consideration things like, preparation for examinations, heavy coursework marking load. So, it's that type of dialogue so that staff feel empowered to have a say, but also you're taking into consideration their external commitments, but also their workload commitments throughout the academic year. I think the other thing to pick up as well, and I'll be honest, I think this is something that we need to be doing more of in Merthyr, is trying to create that culture where people are comfortable in talking about how they are feeling. I know in my senior team, we are all very open with one another about how we're feeling. Not all staff are comfortable with that, but it's providing the mechanisms by which staff have always got somebody to go to if they feel they are struggling with some aspect. It could be work related, it could be issues that are going on in their home lives. It doesn't have to be the line manager. In some cases, it's better if it's not the line manager, but it's having that somebody to talk to. I mean, we have college counsellors that not only support our learners, they also support our staff. We have things like OC Health, we have access to Care First facilities, but it's that safe space, that confidential place where people can actually come out and talk. And I think, again, as a leader, it's important that we role model that behaviour, because by role modelling it, it makes staff more comfortable than saying, do you know what, I don't feel okay, but it's okay for me to say, it's okay, you don't feel like that as well.
I think that's a really, really important point, Lisa, isn't it? Because actually the start of changing culture is around how you break down those barriers and how you break down that stigma. And you mentioned there's some sort of strategies that you put in place to do that. Could I come back to you and ask how did you start to create that culture where stigma was starting to be broken down? What did you do to do that? Because that can be tough in some cultures.
I think what we've done a lot is we've really promoted the support services that are available in the college. And when staff do share that they're struggling with whatever aspect, we signpost them to those support services. So, and I think that has become very much part of college life now, that they know there are counsellors, they know how to access that support. I think the work we've got to do more of now is around that, creating that culture of greater openness, and that there are staff still that may not feel comfortable in talking about how they're feeling and the challenges that they're facing. But it's trying to create that safe space, as I mentioned earlier, so that more and more staff feel comfortable in doing that.
And Kelly?
Yeah, I've just got a really practical example that we did at school that it just echoes everything that's just been said by Nina and Lisa, really. I took a little bit of a risk with staff. And I put out a staff survey. In that warts and all approach, I wanted to find out what staff were thinking. And what we did is exactly what Nina said, was we asked staff to put forward some of the barriers to the things that have happened this term, but some of the celebrations as well. And then we communicate with staff using a weekly bulletin, and each week we communicated back, you said, we did. So we picked up some of the matters that were presented from the feedback in the survey, we acted upon it and then fed back. So I think that cyclical system of them seeing that you're acting upon the suggestions and the points that have been put forward helps to build that trust, isn't it? And it helps to reinforce that you are authentically being an ethical leader, you are authentically, there to listen, to support, and you do have the staff's best interest at heart. Obviously with the premise you can't please everyone, but as long as you've got a consultative approach, and you've got that way of showing staff, look, your points are valid. I couldn't agree more with that, but that's just a small practical example that was really effective for us at school.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think, what's come out really strongly from those answers is that engagement and that communication with your teams to understand actually what some of the issues might be, but not just focusing on the issues, but also focusing on the really positive work that you're all doing. I think over the past couple of years, obviously, because it's been really tough, it's been really difficult, there's an understanding that it's felt like we've spoken about a lot of challenges, but there's a real opportunity to celebrate the amazing work that's going on in the education sector. And I think, just to the point, it's about making sure that you also listen to the voices in your schools that might not usually get heard. Quite often when people are comfortable talking about mental health and wellbeing, they're the people that will talk about it. But there'll be some people who you will never hear their voice. So it's really important to think about the different ways that you can communicate with staff so that those voices can be heard. And the last point I would make, just to Nina, about the policy, there's no point having a policy if it just covers dust on the shelf. A policy is a piece of paper. It's how you live and breathe it. And some of the things that you should consider in that policy is, how do you promote well-being for everybody? Okay, we all have mental health in the same way we have physical health. Some of us live with mental health problems. Some of us have diagnosis. Some of us don't. But we all have mental health and we all exist on a spectrum. So how do you promote well-being for everybody? How do you recognise that there are some people in your organisation that need support for their mental health? And that will be individual to that individual's needs. But how are you responding and providing that support? But really importantly, that third bucket is, what are you doing to tackle the causes of work-related mental health? Because actually, if we don't get under the skin of the causes and we just do what we might call the low-hanging fruit, we're never really going to see that change. So if you're thinking about, a policy, even those 3 buckets, and you think about what you do under those 3 can be really useful. So thank you, everybody. Lisa, yeah, over to you.
Yeah, just picking up on your point you raised there, Faye, about what is causing people's sort of stress. And I think one thing that we picked up during the pandemic, obviously everybody was working remotely, and the boundaries between work and home were blurred. Our staff were working way beyond what I would consider to be a safe working day. And also what we were getting feedback from staff is that learners, because they were also feeling really isolated, were contacting them at all hours. So what we did then, working with the staff in developing a communication protocol for staff and learners. And it was about trying to set boundaries. It was really interesting when we worked with the staff on it, because there were a lot of staff saying, well, I actually like working in the evening because of my family commitments. That is the time of day that I work. And we're saying, right, that's okay, but you're not expected to work in the evenings. In the same way, if you want to send an email in the evening or on a weekend, you're not expected to answer it. You've got your contracted working hours, you should be working within them. And also, like I said, we've done a lot of work with learners as well to try and get across that sense of our staff. During the pandemic, there was a sense that they were almost working, they were available 24/7, because some of our learners were not sleeping in the normal patterns. So we found that has helped in trying to encourage staff to put in those boundaries, not only for themselves, but also for the learners as well. So we found that as quite a helpful strategy.
Yeah, that expectation setting is so important, isn't it? Great. Kelly.
Yeah, just another really insightful thing that we took part in was something called the Colourworks profiles. So, for example, all of our staff, all of our teaching staff they took part in an individual Colourworks profile. So it basically works out about you. It tells about who you are, as like your personality style, your work ethic, etc. So that was really helpful, because now I know which of my staff like that bit of extra communication. I know which of my staff are drivers and they like to take the lead. I know which of my staff now who prefer to take more of a submissive role. So, for example, I made adaptations to how we communicate in the staff meeting. So rather than asking staff on the spot to respond to questions, they were given questions in advance and asked the feedback electronically following on from the meeting, because the majority of my staff needed that additional time for reflection from participating in those profiles. So it's just down to that basics of knowing your staff really well. One-page profiles for staff to be able to articulate how they work best is another. You don't have to spend the personality profile cost for implication for school. It can be just as small as like a one-page profile for staff for them to be able to articulate. But it's so, as a leadership team, it's so important now, because it cuts out those small things that would normally grind people's gears, like how they communicated with, and like some of my staff, if there's a change, they like to know it in advance as far as possible, and they prefer it verbally as opposed to being sent an email, etc. So it's all those little things that help for that nice fluid sort of ethos and thing within the school day. So it's just another useful tip that was really helpful in getting to know the staff really well to support things moving forward.
Yeah, it's great, and it's just a great way to prompt those conversations about who people are as human beings, because we're not just employees, are we? We are human beings, and we bring stuff into the workplace. So I'm going to ask the next question. Alina, I am going to come to you to start with anyway, so you might want to wrap up what you were going to say in this. But the next one you've touched on, obviously, the past couple of years being very stressful. So how do you think schools can create a culture that provides support through times of stress? Because we have to face it, it's not going to suddenly be less stressful over the next couple of years. So how do schools create that culture that provides support through times of stress, but also links with people taking that personal responsibility for their own mental health and well-being. So any tips on that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've got loads of tips, but one of the things I'll pick up on that you've all spoken about just now, about the voices of the staff being really crucial. And I think what we all realise is that not all staff will always be very honest or very truthful about what their needs are, because they potentially maybe don't want to put themselves in that vulnerable situation. And whereas Kelly and Lisa, you know, you've done these surveys to collect staff voices, I'm just going to mention to all of you, don't forget about the amazing anonymous version of Mentimeter, which is a free tool that you can use where you can either set a question or do polls. I mean, it's absolutely fantastic. And you will get anonymous responses, the most truthful of responses. I mean, as an example, yesterday when I was working with over 200 staff in Kent, and I asked them a really, really challenging question, the responses were, whoa, only because they actually knew that it was anonymous and they could be really truthful. And what that head teacher then said at the end of the day, we had no idea this is how people were actually feeling. We had no idea that at these crunch points right now, whether our report writing, that some staff are spending literally hours upon hours writing physically. And then another member of staff said, well, why aren't you using speech to text? So to come back to thinking about those stressful times, make sure, first of all, that you pinpoint those, as Lisa said, in the calendar. Get the staff voices, okay? But then actually make sure that there are reasonable adjustments to all of the other things that are going on. For example, if you're a school that insists on homework, which in my world is a bit of a dirty word, okay? Because let's change it from homework to own work, okay? So if we're allowing our children and young people to own the learning, that is what happens in class, what happens out of class and not necessarily in home, you then don't have to set structured homework for each subject or topic. You can say to them, right, during these particular weeks, you know, it's going to be personal own work, which will allow them to flourish and to really find their magical ingredients. Then your staff will feel, okay, then maybe we can just, you know, pull back a little bit of that, so there'll be less stress with regards to setting, marking, feeding, assessing all of the homework. That's just one little practical strategy. The other practical strategy is this. During these stressful times, if you where you've got maybe a thought of the week or a phrase of the week, if we're talking about emotional literacy with well-being and getting people actually talking about stress, anxiety, grey days, not necessarily depression, or maybe even talking about, I'm thinking of self-harming, or that word, dare we even utter it, transition or suicidal thoughts. If we introduce a key well-being word a week, and then what happens in every lesson, in every meeting, we have what we call, and one school, Ysgol Gyfun Yslyfera, where I went to work with them recently, they have something called Munud I Feddwl, and that's in the children's planner and the staff planner as well, which means let's take a minute to think or to reflect, you know, because of the Welsh translation. That 1 minute, crucially, every single lesson or at key points during the day is either quiet, reflective time, or it actually gives you time to re-energize and to reset. This is what I like to call the simple is the new complex approach to well-being. We don't have to be reading and digesting massive amounts of research and looking at policies and practices. We need to be bringing it back to practical, simple things that we can do collectively as schools, but also individually. Now, if we're talking about individuals and thinking about, you know, what can we do? One of the things that I like to say is I like to embrace everybody into the whole sawboner aspect of well-being, which is I see you, I hear you for everything that you are as an individual. If you've got a problem, you can either write it, speak it, share it, or show it in any different way. And those practical strategies. So if you've got, for example, you might have a worry box with children, but what is it that you've got as a practical strategy for your staff? It may be that, you know, I see you, I hear you, if you want to let me know about somebody else. So using that culture to start that conversation, even if the individual doesn't want to say something themselves, which is why we now have staff wellbeing champions and support champions in our schools. So for your staff to consider, and for everybody in this room, for you to consider how you can better support yourself first as a practical strategy before looking for external support. Get that self-awareness sorted, that physical and emotional, as I mentioned to you earlier, the dual carriageway method. Then go into your self-care mode, which is, what do I know that works well for me? What do I know that works well for me in school? Have I got a safe space to go? Have I got an individual or a group of people to discuss with? And fantastic, as Lisa said, about, you know, counselling sessions, key individuals, because you may not always want to share things with your friends or with a professional colleague. Counsellors, you know, and CBT approaches are brilliant, and use that mind medicine approach that I mentioned earlier. Or maybe what you want to do is to think about, for example, I mean, it could be during an episode of anxiety or stress. You can change the word anxiety to something else, but use the wreck-it approach. So everybody, every individual recognizes the symptoms for what they are. That is for us individually, and don't run away from them. They're going to be challenging. They're going to feel uncomfortable, but embrace them. And when you embrace them, how are you and what are you going to do for self to control them first of all, which is where we go into the prevention and intervention. So, colleagues, before you need to get help from anybody else, think about this. What are your triggers? How are you identifying the triggers so you know what makes you feel anxious, sad, stressed, worried, angry, all of those things? Then go with the interventions about what I said with the mind medicine, which, for example, whereas Ysgol Gavin Yslyfera with the children and the staff, they use a un munud I feddwl, 1 minute to think. You might just want to use an aspect of the PERMA model, which is, do you know what? I'm going to do a little bit of self-gratitude at the end of the day, at the beginning of the day, and then I'm going to assess what's the verdict in a week or so. Do you know what? I actually feel really good about myself, because when I take self-compassion and self-gratitude, I've done a pretty good job today. So with that, it helps us then to become masters of emotional agility. And, you know, sometimes it's really good to actually label or name them. My anxiety friend is Kevin. And you may be wondering, why is my anxiety called Kevin? And can I just apologise if anybody's called Kevin in here? It's nothing personal. It just Kevin comes to mind. And I know that if I name my anxiety Kevin, I can park Kevin in a long-term car park if he's performing. Because the thing is, Kevin is me. I create my own anxiety. Ladies and gentlemen, we actually do this to ourselves. So label your emotions, and then with self-compassion, recognize your patterns, label those thoughts and emotions, act on your values, the values that are pertinent to you. And that in time then will roll out to the children as well, and accept them. Find your purpose, get your gratitude, your hope, your belonging. And then, of course, maybe I'll stop at this point because maybe Lisa and Kelly will want to come in. But if we're looking at those stressful times, what are some of the simple steps that you, me, everybody can do to save the smiles? Nothing like a do not disturb sign. I'm just saying. Okay, nothing like it. Or if you don't want to put a do not disturb sign, because we know we want to have open door access in a lot of workplaces, then how are you communicating that with staff for them to know that, I know you're busy, but yeah, I am a bit busy, but what is the sign that you're actually using? And if you're going to go and work, set timers. So I could go on a little bit longer, but I think I should maybe just stop a little bit there. Otherwise, Lisa and Kelly are not going to speak.
No, thank you, Nina. I think that was really great. And I think, you know, it's an example of there are many tools that we can do for ourselves as individuals, but they also work really well to do with our colleagues in our teams. They create space and conversation, and they're really good ways for us to connect. So I think, you know, looking at some of those tools that you're thinking about doing for yourself individually, you know, if you are responsible for staff mental health and wellbeing in your school, how could you take some of these tools and implement them? Ask people to do them individually if they want to, but also you can do them as a team. It is a really great way to start that conversation. I did want to come to a question that we have in the chat. Maybe if we can start with Lisa or Kelly, feel free to put your hand up if you want to take this one. But it's from Lee, who talks about, you know, being in teaching and, you know, coming back from, you know, teaching for 17 years previously, having 5 years away and coming back, and always feeling like they had a voice and acted on that voice. But that's not the same for everybody. So how do we encourage staff to speak out if they're uncomfortable in doing so? And also, how would you encourage staff to speak out if there's not a forthcoming leader? So if there's not that kind of leader who might be forthcoming and sort of setting that example. Have you, Lisa or Kelly, got any ideas or tips on how you've got people to speak out if they're not feeling comfortable?
I don't mind going, oh, sorry, Lisa, go on. No, but basically it's just providing the spaces. Like, for example, every Thursday between 3 and 4 o'clock, I have an hour that's dedicated to staff drop-in. So because that's a consistent point of, you know, for staff to be able to come along. Initially, you might get the staff you'd expect, but, you know, eventually I've found that all staff will come and they'll encourage each other, if that makes sense, because somebody would have come and had like a successful conversation with a member of the leadership team, then that they would encourage others to bring things forward. So, and I have heard, look, you know, don't forget Thursdays, why don't you pop along to see Kelly and have a chat about X, Y, and Z? So I think providing the spaces, and actually just validating some of the conversations I've had, there hasn't necessarily needed to be a solution. It just necessarily has been there to validate and understand and empathise with the situation that person's in. So I think the emotional intelligence and the response has a lot to do with it as well. And of course, that's a skill in itself. Like, a lot of my leadership team now have been trained in coaching and mentoring for that reason. So that they have got that, you know, more of a listening ear, and more than jumping to try and solve the problem, is trying to get the person that's been spoken to come to that conclusion themselves, isn't it? So it's just about skillful listening, skillful response, and providing spaces, I would say. And back to the reluctance of somebody coming forward, it's just, from my point of view, it's gentle encouragement. And if those spaces are provided, then hopefully they will feel that they can articulate that. But what Nina said earlier is spot on about anonymous surveys. That's what we did, was create an anonymous survey with a suggestion box, and that's kept open now every half term. So staff have got that open point to, you know, to put their opinions forward if they feel they can't verbally articulate it, really. So
great, really, really useful. And Lisa, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that changes overnight. You know, it's part of that cultural change that is undertaken in an institution. I mean, you know, just picking up on the point about surveys, you know, we historically have had an issue around low staff engagement in surveys because of that need for anonymity. So what we've done this year for the first time is we actually have undertaken the Mind Workplace Wellbeing Index survey. So we've literally just had those results back yet, and we'll begin now scrutinising them and putting forward a plan, working with the staff on how we address any of the issues that have arisen out of that. I think I mentioned the staff forum earlier on. So there are representatives on that staff forum from every department. There is a chair and a vice chair of that staff forum. So if somebody isn't comfortable in raising the issue themselves, they have got somebody in their department who they can raise it with, and who will raise it on their behalf anonymously. But equally, when I meet with the chair and the vice chair to discuss the issues that have been raised, that feedback is anonymous. So it's just building that culture of trust, that, you know, people can raise those issues and it's not personalized. And I think just picking up on one of the things as well Nina raised, and mindful of time, is, you know, we're talking about those times of stress. We've all had that Monday morning feeling, you know, and one of the things that we've introduced is we have a Motivational Monday. So on a Monday, we have a playlist that is sort of, you know, broadcast across the college from about 8:45 till 9 o'clock with, you know, an assortment of music. Sometimes it's not our taste. And we have a Feel Good Friday. So we start the week and we end the week on a positive note. And it just, like, you walk into the building, the music is playing and you can breathe and the day begins. So it's just little things like that, just trying to change the culture.
I think that's brilliant. And if any of my team are on this webinar, they'll know that I'm a huge fan of somebody called Brené Brown, and I don't go a session without talking about her. But she talks about something called story stewardship, and it's about how we walk alongside our staff and listen to their stories. We don't necessarily need to lead from the front or push from behind, but we can walk alongside and we can hold their stories. And I think that's really nice, a nice visual way of thinking about how we hold people's experiences and help them open up if they need to. So I am conscious of time, and we are sort of coming nearly to the end. So I'm just going to put you on the spot and give you all sort of 45 seconds to give your one key tip. If everybody in this webinar is thinking, where do we even start? Where do we start with this? What would be your one key tip for getting started? And I know that I'm putting you on the spot here. So if anybody has something in their head, put your hand up and we can start with you. But yeah, your one key takeaway about how somebody on this webinar can go away and get started in terms of thinking about staff mental health and well-being. Oh, Lisa, great. Over to you.
I think you've got to listen to your staff. You've got to find out how your staff are feeling. Because until you can find out how your staff are feeling, how can you actually develop a response? So it's by talking to staff and, you know, gauging the energy in the room.
Great. And I think we've touched on how you can sort of do that during this session. So there are staff surveys, there are drop-ins, opportunities for people to come in and have those informal chats. There's the opportunity to do pulse checks. So, you know, a yearly staff survey will only tell you so much every year. So how do you do those regular pulse checks? And making sure that you listen to the voices that might be always that bit quieter. So lots of tips shared about how you can do that today. Great. Nina, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm just going to literally support exactly what Lisa said. It's got to be about starting a discussion. And you know what? I'm thinking a pack of cards. You know, because sometimes you just let's talk about, you know, that song. Well, we know what word comes next, but let's talk about, and then you've got a set of cards, and then you ask everybody just to take a card, and it's something that's linked to well-being. Now, you can either talk to yourself, talk to a friend, or talk to a group. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you might even want to just talk to the children first, or you might want to talk to the parents. And it has to be sometimes about, you know, what's the weather like in your head today? I mean, I remember sharing, I'm going to name drop here now, sharing first class with Ruby Wax. And she said to me, and we were on our way to Shanghai to deliver some wellbeing training then. She said to me, Nina, tell me, how's the weather in your head today? And I just thought, what's she asking me? What do you mean about the weather? I'm asking you without saying, how are you feeling? How's the weather in your head? And sometimes just changing that language, bring humor into it as well, because some of those really, really difficult conversations can be really, really challenging. So sometimes balancing it with a little bit of humor, and that can go a very, very long way. Brilliant. Pack of cards.
Thank you, Nina. And Kelly, over to you.
I'm going to start with a personal reflection after a sharp learning curve as a head teacher is fill your own cup up and not feel guilty about it, because obviously you need to be stable yourself in order to support your staff. And that was one thing that I didn't do very well at the beginning, but I've learned that, you know, it's about taking that space and that time where you need to take your non-contact time where you can. In the periods you can't, obviously, you know, that's understandable, where things are a little bit more settled. Take that strategic time, take that time out for reflection and for yourself. yourself really, and then that will help you to support your team and support your leadership team and the rest of your staff as well. So yeah, that's my personal reflection after I read a brilliant book called Leading from the Edge, and it was something that I really took on board, you know, after reading that about my personal self-care. So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And some ideas in the chat here: be visible, showing empathy, which are really important. And there was a question that we haven't sort of got time for in terms of Lisa and Kelly, how you kind of shoulder the burden of this. Burden maybe is not the right word, but you're taking a lot on in the roles that you do. And so what I just wanted to flag is something that we're offering in Wales, and that is funded by Welsh Government, is support for head teachers, deputy heads and assistant heads. So we are providing free access to peer support sessions where we bring you together with 6 peers across Wales, and you have access to 6 sessions with a facilitator like Nina. So that would be wonderful. And it's an opportunity for you to come and to talk to each other about some of the challenges and issues you're facing, but also to think about your own well-being and to think about yourself. And alongside that, we're also offering one-to-one support. So if you prefer to have support in that one-to-one space, we're offering free sessions of one-to-one support with a qualified counsellor. So that is available in Wales. And we do, you know, if you are a head or a deputy or an assistant head on this session, then please do, I'll share our website details. Please do access that. So that leads me to wrap up really. So I just want to say a huge thank you to our panelists. You've been absolutely fantastic and we really do appreciate your time. Thank you for everybody that's attended. The event has been recorded, so it will be available on EWC's website and also Education Support's website and social channels within the next few weeks. And a link is going to be posted in the chat to gather your feedback for today's event. So can you take a few minutes to fill that in? We're always looking to learn what more do people want, what less do people want. It's really important for us because we deliver lots of webinars. You can continue to tweet about the event using the EWC_CGA Twitter handle, or also at Ed Support UK, get that right. Also, we're really pleased to say that we're going to be continuing to work in partnership with EWC, and on the back of this event we're going to be developing a good practice guide for the mental health and wellbeing of those working in education in Wales. So please look out later this year for us publishing that. And also I'm just going to pop in the chat the Education Support website. So on our website you'll see all of the information about what we offer as a charity, and also access to a huge number of resources and tools. So all the stuff that we've been talking about, all the kind of policies and practical tips, we've kind of done a lot of it for you. So you don't have to start from scratch. You can go onto our website and there's a huge amount there for you. And also just to flag that on the website, you can see the details of our helpline and our helpline poster that we recommend that you put up in your schools so that people know that we're there. So just again, a huge thank you for joining today. A huge thank you for the amazing work that you do each and every day, not just the past couple of years, each and every day. You are absolutely wonderful and it's been a pleasure to be here today. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your evening.